This podcast is supported by the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai, an international leader in research, education, and patient care. The medical and graduate school is part of the Mount Sinai Health System, one of the largest academic medical systems in New York City. Ranked among the top recipients of NIH funding, researchers at Mount Sinai have made breakthrough discoveries advancing the health of patients. Here, clinicians and scientists push the boundaries in cardiology, cancer, immunology, neuroscience, genomics, geriatrics, environmental medicine, and artificial intelligence. The Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai, we find a way. This is a science podcast for May 21st, 2026. I'm Sarah Crespi. First this week, I talk with senior international correspondent Rich Stone about the evolutionarily deep roots of our immune system. There are surprising parallels between us and the way bacteria and archaea fight off viruses. After that, we have researcher Dominic Rohner. He talks about the links between cuts in international aid and violent conflict. His team harnessed the natural experiment of the USAID work stoppage ordered by the Trump administration to study this connection. After that, books editor Valerie Thompson interviews student and author Theo Baker. Baker's book, How to Rule a World, covers his investigation of research misconduct by former Stanford president Mark Tessier-Levine. We've probably all heard of CRISPR and maybe restriction enzymes. These are super important tools for editing genes, for genetic engineering, cutting into DNA specifically in the lab. These are borrowed from bacterial systems designed to fight off the viruses that attack them, called phage. We don't have CRISPR in our cells. Plants don't have it. And this lack of similarity, this lack of CRISPR, lack of restriction enzymes, it's been thought that that's the theme. We don't have the same tools for fighting off viruses as bacteria and archaea. But it turns out CRISPR and restriction enzymes, these tools, could actually be the exception to the rule, and that there is a surprising amount of overlap between how bacteria fight off viruses and how our immune systems do. Those of us with complex immune systems, with antibodies and all kinds of cells tailored to fight these battles, we're kind of using similar systems, which points to a really deep evolutionary history for this. So this week in science, senior international correspondent Rich Stone wrote about these surprising similarities between our immune systems and the way bacteria and archaea fight off phage, which are viruses that infect them. Hi, Rich. Welcome back to the podcast.
Hi, Sarah. Good to be back.
Didn't mean to steal all your thunder there. I just wanted to set people up because it's going to be dense and lots of alphabet soup coming up in a little bit.
It's a complicated story for sure.
Yeah. So, Rich, this is not your beat. Normally, your beat is going dangerous places and talking about physics, I guess. But how did you end up covering, bacterial weapon systems?
Yeah, that's definitely not my usual terrain. So I happened to be at a symposium in Tokyo last October. So I was abroad.
Yeah. Okay.
And I heard a talk by Rotem Sorek about his work on bacterial defense systems. And I was just blown away. I didn't even realize how this field was exploding.
I kind of set it up by saying this goes against the countervailing thought that we don't share our defense systems with these ancient organisms. But as you say, so many papers have been written about this. The field has really grown. It's kind of now become, okay, well, we do have more in common than we previously thought.
When you think about it, both our human immune systems and bacterial immune systems, they are trying to disable or destroy invading viruses. In hindsight, it may have been surprising to assume that there weren't some homologies and some shared machinery between the two domains of life. But certainly, the discovery of CRISPR and restriction enzymes being only in bacteria had created that assumption that these were entirely separate evolutionary responses to invaders. But just the explosion in research in the past several years showing that there are a number of systems, at least 12 and counting, where eukaryotes, including humans, plants, fungi, have essentially inherited or co-opted or somehow acquired bacterial defense systems way back in the distant reaches of time, probably when eukaryotes were single-cell organisms, and have been using them ever since, essentially.
This long history, this long association means that we can start to look to bacteria and archaea, we can't forget archaea, and say, well, how do these systems work? And then they become model organisms. They become, systems for experimenters to kind of investigate and then, take those answers and apply them to what's going on with eukaryotes, multicellular life forms.
I'm glad you brought up archaea because eukaryotes, the domain of life that includes animals, plants, fungi, protists, consensus now says they likely evolved from archaeal ancestors. It's now apparent that some human immune systems may trace back to those roots. And a great classic example now, classic, it was just discovered a few years ago, but one that is clear is viprin, which is the antiviral protein that had been identified in human white blood cells back in 97. And 25 years later, a team led by Claude Bernheim at the Pasteur Institute found it to be widespread in archaea. And then related viprin systems were identified in bacteria. These molecules are integral to both kind of our own innate first-line defenses against invading viruses and archaea, who've been fighting off their own phages for the past 2-3 billion years.
Right.
But here they are. They're in bacteria, they're in archaea. Humans probably inherited these from archaea, from our archaeal ancestors. So it's such a cool link.
Speaking of inheritance, like one thing that is pretty different between us and bacteria and archaea is that they have all kinds of ways of creating genes, either through plasmids, which are little circles that are inherited when they divide, or through horizontal gene transfer, where they just kind of hand them over to neighboring conspecific. So does any of this stuff get to us that way, or is it mostly something that evolved over time and stayed with us?
It's very hard to know for sure. You can't directly test that theory. You can look at the relationship between the genetic sequences of the genes and so forth and look at how they may have evolved through time. But the suspicion, at least, is that the very early eukaryotes, the single cell eukaryotes, most probably acquired some defense systems through horizontal gene transfer directly from bacteria. And the reason that that is a attractive hypothesis is that there are certain immune pathways that are found in bacteria and eukaryotes, but not in archaea.
It just makes me think how hard it is to study a connection that is this old when you're starting to count back in the billions of years. It's kind of amazing.
Yeah, it's so fascinating that you have bacterial evolution, bacteria evolving at a much faster rate in terms of like generation turnover than humans, obviously. You have phages evolving at an even faster rate than bacteria.
Yeah.
And yet the bacteria somehow have been able to constantly tinker and experiment, come up with new defenses. Some are extremely effective, broad defenses like CRISPR, some are very specific. But you see these have persisted as essential tools for billions of years now.
Phage are viruses. People grow phage in the lab all the time. They're pretty well known, but there are different kinds all out there in the world. And I think it's the most common type of organism in the world. Yeah.
Well, phages are viruses, so they're not considered a life form, but they are the most common, I guess you can say, biological entity,
Sure.
whatever you want to call them. They outnumber bacteria about 10 to 1. And there are more phages in total on planet Earth than all organisms, period. We're in a sea of phages. These phages have been a laboratory tool for decades. There's always been longstanding hope that phages could be harnessed as a treatment for especially pernicious antibiotic-resistant bacteria. So this explosion of interest in fundamental phage biology that is occurring now, unraveling all the systems that the phages use to attack bacteria, how the bacteria counteract phages. One hope from this research, application of this research, is that scientists will be able to engineer phages that can be used as much more successful therapies.
So one thing that this better understanding these bacterial systems is we can use it to kind of, scale down and look at immune processes.
You can essentially explore concepts of human immunity in bacterial cells. So it's going to be a lot easier to study. And there were some really nifty results presented earlier this month at the symposium on the immune system of bacteria. There were a couple of presentations from scientists who showed that they could take very specific human antiviral proteins, put them into bacteria, And these proteins fight off the phages.
This is nuts.
Even in a field that has just been, scientists say, drinking from a fire hose of all the new results that have been coming out in the past few years, these two talks just really startled and excited a lot of people who were there. And they were saying, this is just incredible that you have this specific ability of these proteins to fight off both the viruses that infect humans and phages.
Yeah, it's crazy.
So coming from that back to molecular tools, for sure, there are very important tools that have emerged from understanding bacterial defense systems. We can start with CRISPR. CRISPR is the premier gene editing tool now. CRISPR is one of the key defense systems of bacteria. But there is a lot of excitement that these new bacterial defense systems that are being discovered now are going to lead to new tools. There was a recent paper on using retrons, which is another bacterial defense system, as a research tool for very specific kinds of DNA cutting, basically being able to have a new tool to study and engineer viruses. So this came out of Seth Shipman's lab at the Gladstone Institute. And as Sam Sternberg at Columbia told me, this war between bacteria and phages has really given scientists an immense repository of high-value enzymes and biosynthetic capabilities.
So you've covered a lot of ground in your story. I don't think we're going to get to all of it here, but are you satisfied? Are you going to keep following this field as as it develops?
I'm going to try. Like I say, there's a paper in Science and Nature every week. Which ones do you cover?
Exactly.
Just so much coming at us. I do think this is a area that's going to be in strong contention for a future Nobel Prize. So it's nice to look at it that way and see how the field develops as it builds toward that climax. But as the researchers say, they're only scratching the surface right now.
All right, Rich, thanks so much for talking with me.
Thank you, Sarah. It was a pleasure.
Rich Stone is a senior international correspondent for the News from Science team. You can find a link to his feature and some really nice diagrams laying out some of these things that we talked about at science.org/podcast.
Hi, Science Podcast listeners. This is Kevin McLean. I'm one of the producers on the show. I just wanted to hop in here before we get started to ask you to consider subscribing to News from Science. Every week on the podcast, we bring you one of the stories that the News from Science team has published, but there's so much more than what we can cover on our show here. For only about 50 cents a week, the money from subscriptions goes directly to supporting nonprofit science journalism, reporting on science policy, investigations, international news, and the latest breakthroughs from all around the world of science. Support nonprofit science journalism with your subscription at science.org/news. You have to scroll down and click subscribe on the right side. That's science.org/news.
Submissions for the Eppendorf and Science Prize for Neurobiology are now open. The prize for neurobiology recognizes outstanding young researchers, age 35 and under, for exceptional neurobiological research conducted in the past 3 years. The winner receives $25,000 and publication of their essay in science. Apply now at science.org/prizes before the June 15th, 2026 deadline. Also on the site this week is more coverage of the Ebola outbreak in the DRC in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Our crack public health and infectious disease reporting team is on it. You can follow that on the site or you can follow it on Blue Sky. Also out this week in science, we have a review called Oscillatory Biology of Sleep, Linkage to Dementia by Maken Nedergaard, in which she talks about how sleep disruptions, it could be from medications, stress, or disease state, may be linked to increased dementia risk because certain damaging molecules may not be cleared out of the brain when sleep gets disturbed. Stay tuned for my chat with Dominic Rohner about the impact of international aid cuts on violence. In January 2025, the freshly inaugurated second Trump administration issued a stop work order for USAID. This is the U.S. Agency for International Development, slamming the brakes on one of the largest efforts in the world to reduce poverty, hunger, and the spread of infectious disease. Since that stop work order, Science's news team has been covering the impact on research, Clinical trials were stopped. US grants went away for things that were in process, science is being done. And they also launched a series on the effect on the world's children with stories on the impact of prevention of HIV, malaria, and malnutrition in kids globally. Recently, in the research pages of Science, Dominic Rohner and colleagues published a paper on how the stoppage has resulted in the spread of violence, revealing an increase in conflict in areas with the highest aid needs. Hi, Dominic. Welcome to the Science Podcast.
Hello, Sarah. Thanks for having me.
Maybe not everyone is familiar with this kind of full remit of USAID, like, yes, alleviate poverty and disease, but it also was tasked with increasing peace and democracy around the world. But not everyone agrees that providing aid like this does reduce conflict. What are the opposing views here? What are the two sides?
So there is indeed a very vibrant scholarly debate on the matter. Several academic studies have found that actually development aid can correlate with more conflict, and other studies that have found that development aid can correlate with fewer armed conflicts. So it's kind of the eternal debate where typically an economist would answer, it depends.
Right.
It would depend on the details. If aid is very well managed, usually it's rather something that can reduce the risk of conflict, while if aid is administered in a way that it can be easily appropriated by armed group, then it may actually increase the risk of conflict.
So you treated this withdrawal of USAID from all these different parts of Africa as kind of a natural experiment to see the impact of turning off these different resources. This is quite different from the studies that have been used to address this question before, these questions in the past.
Actually, there was a gap in the literature, if you like. In the existing literature, there were studies in various countries, but it was often either one country with a very specific context, a very specific program, and all these studies were about introducing aid, increasing aid. Now, the question of a massive drop in aid that affects various countries at the same time has not been studied. And so for us, it was a question we thought that would merit investigation indeed.
Right. And so how are you able to kind of capture this data across such a wide group at all these different levels that aid is provided in different countries and different contexts?
We do an analysis that is called difference in difference, statistically speaking. I mean, this is the science podcast, so I may
Yeah, okay.
I may use more complex terms than in other podcasts. But basically, what we do is we look at the differential effect of this aid cut for countries that have been heavily receiving US aid versus areas that have been less on the recipient side. And so we would expect that this effect has much stronger impact on places that were very reliant on US aid. This allowed us to look at the heterogeneous effect spatially of a policy change over time.
Was it easy to track who had aid, how much, and what was happening?
So it was easy, and we should give credit to who deserves credit. So this is a data set called GODAT. They have put together this very helpful data set on georeferenced aid, where you know exactly where aid is, not just at the country level, but much more fine-grained in the exact geographical region. Also for armed conflict, we actually have very, very detailed data. I mean, research on armed conflict has been much increased in recent years, not only because, sadly, there are more reasons to study them because there have been more conflicts, but also because the data has so much improved. And there are various teams of political scientists around the world who have put together these data sets.
What did you count as conflict? You said armed conflict a couple of times, but did you also consider other kinds of violence that arise in these regions?
The kind of types of conflict that we study in this particular article are battles, so armed battles, people with Kalashnikov, for example, but also protests or riots, kind of violent protests, also violence against civilian, government repression, for example.
What kind of correlations did you see between the levels of aid received and the rise in conflict after withdrawal?
So when we compare places, what we see is that after the aid gets cut, we see an increase in conflict in the heavily aid-reliant areas. That's sad news, of course. It wasn't clear at first whether that would be the case, because there are plenty of arguments that aid has two effects. Aid does two things. One is kind of what we call the opportunity cost effect. When you receive aid, well, this money will help you maybe to invest in your business, you create jobs, you have a job, you are less keen to be recruited by some warlord, for example, if you have perspectives in life. That's the positive side. It creates opportunities for people in life. Now, there is, of course, also a darker side of aid, and these are valuable things that can be appropriated. So, for example, in the study with Patrick Prémont for Niger, what we found there is that, well, actually, in some places, aid would increase the risk of conflict when people from Boko Haram, from neighboring Nigeria, would come and attack places. It's a double-edged knife. So that's why at the onset, it wasn't quite clear which of the two effects would prevail. But now from this study, what we know is especially a very rapid, unanticipated, massive drop in aid will so much perturb the local equilibrium that we see this violence-inducing effect compared to the control group of places receiving less aid.
Is the rapidity here very important for your finding? Do you feel like the rapid withdrawal of the aid was a key element of, the increase in conflict?
It's hard to tell. In order to really answer this question, we would have to have some different historical case where the aid removal was gradual, and then we would be able to really compare the effects. The interpretation that it may be the rapidity and the massiveness of the aid withdrawal is not that far-fetched, because basically what it means is that people have jobs financed by aid, and then suddenly these jobs disappear. Well, if this is gradual, if you phase out aid, people may be able to adjust more easily. And so one of the policy implications would be for European governments, for example, various European countries are thinking about cutting aid. The study can be seen as a word of caution. We don't know whether it is the rapidity that had the effects that we observe in the data, but there are reasons to think that it may be the case. So if any other country decides to reduce aid, it would be maybe cautious to do this gradually.
The slower transition or a transition plan. Taking this out of the context of just the USAID stoppage, how does this fit in with kind of the broader questions about aid and conflict?
So I have this book that came out with Cambridge University Press recently, The Peace Formula. And there, one of the things I discuss is that basically for peace, for lasting peace, you have three ingredients, three pillars: voice, work, and warranties. So democracy, you need jobs, people need to have jobs, and also security guarantees that their livelihoods and lives are safe. In that sense, it's clear that, of course, fragile countries that are very poor are the most likely to being at risk of experiencing conflict. And that's a very, very strong correlation in the data. So if you look at the 50 countries that have been most in conflict in the last 2 or 3 decades, that correlates very, very strongly with the poorest countries in the world. What we also find is that good institutions matter. Again, in line with what I said regarding the book, where basically the effects are particularly strong in places with weak governance.
So if you don't have anybody to kind of back up the aid being withdrawn to buffer the effects of the sudden withdrawal of international aid, it's going to be harsher on the locals.
These mechanisms of opportunity cost is really powerful. You see that today, the New York Times had an article about Russian recruiting in Africa for sending people to fight against Ukraine. They explained that partly the recruitment used deception to attract people, but what really helped the recruitment is the poverty. If you're very, very desperate, you don't have a job, you have a family to nourish, you don't know what to do, you're much easier prey to be hired by a warlord than if you really have good opportunities in life. And we see that in many, many studies.
I talked to someone who studied gangs in Mexico, the cartels, and the same thing, like recruiting into cartels is so much because there is no other option.
Yeah, no, exactly. So other big things that can help us to achieve peace, and which partly are aligned with the goals USAID had, are things like you want to invest in education, you want to invest in health, you want to invest in productive labor markets. If people have opportunities in life, the number of people who genuinely like to shoot at others and are sadists is thankfully very small. Most people join warfare because they're desperate and have no other perspectives in life and don't know what to do. When people are in a cozy office as you or me, it wouldn't cross our minds to give up our jobs to run around with a Kalashnikov. In terms of the big picture, that's what we should invest in the productivity of people so that they can really have choices in life and that they can thrive.
Going back to the debate that we opened with, this idea that aid reduces conflict or increases conflict in some cases, and that there being different circumstances. Does this feed into that? Does this kind of help resolve it, or does it just add another context or another circumstance to think about?
One of the results that you see, and we wrote a book with a team of World Bank scholars on the topic some years back, is that one of the things that is a main driver of conflict are natural resources, right? Like oil or minerals as well. And what you see is that when this money from these natural resources gets used in something that cannot be appropriated, like human capital, you can steal physical capital, but you cannot steal human capital. Then this effect of people wanting to appropriate goes down because you cannot appropriate it. And I think that's the same story with aid. It's the same logic, is if aid is done in a way that the benefits are embodied in people.
Like you can't steal a school.
Exactly. Yeah, you cannot steal education from people. You cannot steal good health from people. If aid is not appropriable easily, then the effects would typically be on the very peace-promoting side. If aid is just randomly dumped in a non-coordinated way and there are valuable stuff that can be stolen, then these countervailing forces can kick in and the net effect can be detrimental. The point is not of stopping aid. The point is of improving the modalities of administration.
We have a few more years of this Trump administration, and who knows what's going to happen next. And I don't see anything really changing at USAID in the next couple of years. What do you think the long-term fallout from this is going to be in terms of conflict in Africa or in other places that were served by USAID?
What we see in our data is that the effect persists over time. When we run these, what we call event study analysis, in some, the effects become even slightly bigger or they don't collapse. So they're persistent over time. We plan to do some follow-up study where we look at the medium run effects, but also of how other outcomes may be. So that's on our agenda, and I think it's important to do that. I think what Europe has some responsibility as well. I think Europe, several European leaders have a tendency to just copy what the US does. If the US cuts aid and the US cuts funding for research, some European countries may have a tendency to do just the same thing without thinking much. I don't think that's how we should behave. And so I think it's important that, especially in times when if one donor decides to reduce aid, then maybe others, rather than reducing, one option could be to step up and give more aid.
Dominic, thanks so much for talking with me about this important issue.
Thanks so much, Sarah. It was a pleasure to talk to you.
Dominic Rohner is a professor of economics at the Geneva Graduate Institute and University of Lausanne. You can find a link to the paper we discussed at science.org/podcast. Next up, Science's books editor, Valerie Thompson, talks with student journalist Theo Baker. Baker's new book offers readers a behind-the-scenes look at the reporting he conducted as a freshman at Stanford that exposed scientific misconduct in papers co-authored by the university's president.
Hi, I'm Valerie Thompson, Science's books and culture editor. I'm here today with Theo Baker, the student journalist whose reporting triggered an investigation into Stanford University President Mark Tessier-Lavigne that eventually led to his resignation in 2023. Baker's new book, How to Rule the World, recounts his experience reporting on this story. Theo, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having me. This is awesome.
Let's start with Stanford. So it was pretty obvious to you as soon as you arrived as a freshman that was kind of unlike a lot of other universities in some interesting ways. What made it so different?
I showed up here not thinking I was going to be a journalist of any kind. So I showed up here as a coder. And as a consequence, I met and sort of saw inside this secret world that exists for the most promising handful of students who are identified as the sort of next $1 trillion startup founders. I was just close enough to sort of peer into this world and to see that it existed and to know that there were these sort of the slush funds, yacht parties, and all of these sort of extraordinary perks lavished on a very select few. This place is bizarro world. Even if you come into it with a sort of presupposition of how Silicon Valley works, the integration and the entanglement of this place and its surrounding area is unlike anything else, unlike any other institution of higher education in the world. And it means that that Stanford has really become sort of this bleeding edge for a trend that you see across higher education right now, which is this sort of corporatization and really the monetization of students, right? At Stanford, the earlier you can get in on the ground floor of the next trillion-dollar company, the more you have made your career. So these adults are hunting relentlessly for a meal ticket. They're trying to get in as early as possible to get their hooks in. And the school, in turn, benefits from it because the more you have these kids dropping out to start billion-dollar companies, whether or not they're actually going to be successful in the long run, the more that they'll kick back their proceeds to the university and reflect that this place is the cradle of innovation that it claims to be.
So I think this really dovetails into my next question, which is you were approached early on to interview for an unofficial class that was called How to Rule the World. You didn't end up taking it, but you spoke to the instructor and you interviewed a number of the students who took it. What was that class about, and how did it kind of fit into the other ideas and attitudes that you were encountering on campus?
There's a secret class that takes place every week on the Stanford campus, with 12 students who are selected through this cloak and dagger admissions process, in which this arrogant Silicon Valley CEO teaches them explicitly the way to manipulate and deceive their way into success. And it's not an actual class. What it really is more like a secret club or a skull and bones for the aspiring tech elite. It's this guy is playing the same game that everyone else around here is, which is how do you get in with the next generation of future oligarchs early? And he has done this brilliant maneuver and effectively made them come to him because he's created this exclusive symbol of, the most hush hush insider elements of this sort of Stanford inside Stanford that I identified. I ended up titling my book, How to Rule the World, because I think it's sort of a perfect encapsulation of the mentality that I'm writing about, right? They are being taught that you have to get ahead at any cost, that you have to move as quickly as you can. And it doesn't matter if there are consequences, because if you win out in the long run, all bad behavior can be excused.
Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit. You've joined the student newspaper. You're just weeks into your freshman year, and you get wind that there were potential problems in scientific research that had previously been published by Stanford's president. What was the initial accusation, and what made you think, I have to pursue this?
Well, and I think your readers will probably be familiar with PubPeer, the site where mostly pseudonymous accounts, usually scientists, dissect published research papers. There had been these comments that began springing up on PubPeer in around 2015, a handful of papers that Mark Tessier-Levine had been involved in. Basically, these were commenters pointing out places where there appeared to be anomalies or irregularities in some of the figures. And there had not been any response from Mark Tessier-Levine or the journals. These papers were all still up and unmarked. And this has all been happening right around the time when Mark Tessier-Levine was first being considered for the Stanford presidency. He assumed the office in 2016. And so when I first got referred to these PubPeer posts, I really didn't think that there was going to be all that much to it. This felt like exactly the kind of thing that would have already been looked into if there were something there. It seemed impossible to imagine that he would have gone through the whole vetting process and this wouldn't have come up, or that, such a highly public figure, a man who had been the chief scientific officer of Genentech, the president of Rockefeller University, now the president of Stanford University, one of the largest major research institutions in the world. I began looking into these sort of allegations that had been made on PubPeer. I worked with forensic image analysts, including the incredible Elizabeth Bick, to begin vetting that initial suite of concerns, and then worked from there progressively to get further and further inside Mark Tessier-Levine's labs to supplement with all of the interviews and in-depth research that made this into the story that it became.
So the first story where you're breaking this news, how was that story received?
Well, it was somewhat astonishing to us that the board of trustees opened an investigation into Mark Tessier-Levine within 24 hours of the piece coming out. Mark Tessier-Levine had issued his defense through a Stanford spokeswoman, claiming that none of these issues had any bearing on the papers that were identified and that he had effectively nothing to do with any of them. If I recall correctly, all of the papers that were mentioned in that initial article have since been retracted. So obviously there were some issues with the data that did affect the interpretation, but it was astonishing. As soon as the board opened an investigation, that just became another part of the story to cover. The board's initial statement that they put out when they said they were going to investigate his research praised Mark Tessier-Levine's, quote, integrity and honor, which I know to some observers seemed, I think understandably, as if they were prejudging the outcome. And of course, everything sort of spiraled from there in that point.
Your reporting didn't stop with that initial story. If anything, it kind of became a little all-consuming as you were kind of trying to balance what was effectively an extracurricular activity with your classwork and your other commitments. And you really don't shy away from discussing the toll that took on you. What made you want to tell this more personal side of the story?
I think there are a few reasons for it. Certainly not because it's the most comfortable or wonderful thing to have a 17 and 18-year-old version of yourself frozen in amber on a page. But I think the main thing was that I'm asking this institution to be honest and transparent, to reckon with its incredible positive attributes and its flaws. I just didn't think it would be an honest story without applying that same standard to myself. I mean, I was a teenager, in a situation that I had no real way to understand and certainly no expectation of being in until I found myself in the middle of it. And I was doing work that I knew if I didn't do it, it wouldn't be done otherwise. And Mark Tessier-Levine had hired these very high-powered lawyers to continually threaten our reporting. At the same time, I was a freshman in college, like breaking up with my long-distance girlfriend from high school, going to my first party, doing all of these things that are already, I think, sort of stressful and unusual in the most normal of circumstances, but obviously with context that made it even stranger. And as you allude to, I didn't make the best choices freshman year. I didn't always handle the pressure very well. I crumbled, here and there.
So the events that you describe in your book, they all took place during your freshman year of college. How did that kind of impact the rest of your time at Stanford?
It's been weird. Wouldn't pretend otherwise. Look, I think for all college students, the last 4 years have been a very tumultuous period. So at Stanford, already like our freshman year, we had everything to do with the president, sure, but ChatGPT also came out like a few months into our time at school. That is, of course, a paradigm shift for all of education going forward that we still don't fully know what the effects will be. Our sophomore year was marked by the protests that began after October 7th and the invasion of Gaza and the political rancor that emerged from that. Clearly the most divisive and visceral protest cycle that has been seen on college campuses in decades, pitting students against their administrations and, more importantly, against each other. Right? Our junior year, the federal government decided to wage an unprecedented assault on higher education. The last few years have been a very weird time to be on college campuses to begin with. And certainly, I do feel privileged to have had the opportunity to be a reporter and to cover all of these issues that, I think have a lot of wider salience for the rest of the world, for the rest of the country.
So you're a senior now. In a few weeks, you're going to be a Stanford graduate. Do you have plans? What's next for you?
Well, fingers crossed. Got to get over that hurdle first.
Of course.
Don't want to trip at the 5-yard line. I mean, my focus right now is just trying to get this book out and hopefully start some productive conversations. I think a lot of this stuff, if we want to understand how Elizabeth Holmes happens or how Sam Bankman-Fried happens, or how this mentality that clearly exists in Silicon Valley of the whole move fast and break things, philosophy works, you have to understand how the next generation of tech oligarchs are being trained at a moment when there's just so much funding going in every possible direction, when the grift, is so apparent. None of this is normal. And we're vesting huge amounts of power and authority in a system that does not have the guardrails to catch or really ward off bad behavior. Again, these cut corners, it starts small, right? You come in as a freshman. I arrived with these kids I knew who were these idealistic teens who love technology. And you watch them get plucked from the crowd into this world as 18 or 19-year-olds where they are being wined and dined every day or multiple times a week by VCs. They are being offered something called pre-idea funding, where they are being told, just go out and make something. Here's the money. And then suddenly they've locked themselves into this, having made huge promises that they may or may not be able to deliver on. And they learn how to get ahead by cutting corners, by pretending that a launch demo, is actually reflective of what their technology can do when their product can do nothing of the sort. By, creating the reality distortion field that Silicon Valley has been so known for. One of the major goals for this book was to sort of see how misconduct works at every level.
I'm not going to tell you what to do, but I feel like there's a career's worth of reporting here in the future. So just to put that out there.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of news these days.
Yeah.
We're not short on that. That's not our problem.
Well, Theo, thanks so much for joining me today.
Well, thanks so much for having me.
And that concludes this edition of the Science Podcast. If you have any comments or suggestions, write to us at sciencepodcast@aaas.org. To find us on podcasting apps, search for Science Magazine. We've also launched a YouTube channel just for the podcast. To find that, search Science Magazine Podcast to listen and subscribe. Or you can always listen on our website, science.org/podcast. This show was edited by me, Sarah Crespi, and Kevin McLean. We had production help from Podigy. Our music is by Jeffrey Cook and Wen Koi Wen. On behalf of Science and its publisher, AAAS, thanks for joining us.